Family takes care of family. That's what my parents preached while they quietly used my name, my credit, and my card to lock in a $99,000 wedding for their golden boy. When I refused to pay, they called me ungrateful and told me to get out. That's the moment I stopped being their doormat and started being their audit. In the next minutes, you'll see exactly how I turned their lie into a paper trail that talks, the bank call that froze the charges, the recording that proved the impersonation, and the packet that landed on the venue manager's desk at 11:42 a.m. By noon, the string quartet had no groom, the caterer had no authorization, and my parents had no story left that could survive daylight. I'm going to show you receipts, timelines, and the decision that cost them more than money, reputation. If you've ever been told to be grateful while someone picks your pocket, stay. By the end of this video, you'll know the 3 steps that stop family fraud cold. How I got provisional credit back. How the IRS letter changed the guest list, and why I walked away with my name and only my name. They wanted silence. I brought proof. They wanted a fairy tale. I brought facts. Who's humiliated now? Who pays? Watch to the end and I'll expose everything. My name is Dan Cole. I'm 34, a systems analyst who keeps a hospital's network stable so doctors can focus on patients instead of spinning wheels on a screen. I was raised in a house where my father fixed what broke and my mother balanced the checkbook by hand. And I learned early that showing up is a promise, not a performance. That habit, reliability, would become the very handle someone grabbed to move me where they wanted. I sat at my kitchen table with an official envelope in my hands. The kind of paper that makes a man straighten his back before he opens it. Inside was a brief acknowledgement from the IRS that a report had been received under Form 3949A. No drama, no accusations. Just a note that information alleging misuse of a taxpayer's identity was now on file. My name rested in the middle of the page like a nailhead just proud of the wood. It wasn't about taxes, not really. It was proof that somewhere with a straight voice and a steady tempo, someone had stepped into my name and walked it around as if it were theirs. A week earlier, before that envelope existed, a phone call had slipped past guardrails that should have held. I didn't hear it ring, but I learned later what it contained, a woman confirming details only I should have used. She offered my exact street address as if she were reading it off my mail, my date of birth without hesitation, the last 4 digits that anchor a social security number. Then she reached for an old power of attorney, something that should have been retired years ago, and used it like a skeleton key. The bank's system, seeing a clean address match a legitimate merchant code and a well-rated venue, did what systems do when the lights are all green. They let the charge through on a temporary approval. That evening, on my side of the glass, nothing looked dangerous. I reheated dinner, answered 2 emails I should have ignored, and opened my banking app to check the month's edges like I always do. One line stopped me: Cold Oak Hollow Estate, $24,500 pending. I scrolled for reassurance and found the opposite. A florist for $7,800. A tuxedo shop for $3,200. A tasting fee for $1,150. The numbers weren't guesses. They were tidy and real, the shape of events already underway. I locked the card with a thumb press and watched the indicator slide from open to closed. I turned on purchase alerts for anything over $500, something I should have done years ago, and set an appointment with the bank for the next morning. I wrote the time on a sticky note anyway, because writing steadies the hands when the ground feels a half-inch lower than it did at lunch. Then the phone rang with a name I know too well. My mother's voice arrived, already moving, as if we'd been in the middle of an agreement I'd somehow forgotten. There was a little banking hiccup, nothing to worry about. Family looks after family. Give it a few days and it will clear. She used a tone people save for children and favors, and she wore the words like a borrowed smile. I told her I didn't agree. I kept my voice even and repeated that I hadn't authorized anything. She reached back into history and reminded me of a time they handled things for me as if help were a tab that could be run indefinitely. I said I had a bank appointment in the morning. She said I was making too much of it. I ended the call before she could sew the word family into a flag she expected me to salute. A moment later, the family group chat lit up, the one named after a joke that's been tired for years. My brother Aiden posted a photo that looked like a magazine layout: white chairs in careful rows, a gazebo wrapped in flowers, late light falling across the lawn as if it had been cued. "Venue secured," he wrote. "The picture wanted you to admire the aisle." My eyes drifted to the corner where vendor vans would back in and someone with a clipboard would ask whether the balance had cleared. I didn't answer. Anything I typed right then would have been something I'd have to walk back later. Instead, I took screenshots of every relevant screen in the banking app: merchant names, timestamps, pending statuses, because records have a way of changing their clothes after midnight, and you keep what you can while it still looks like what you saw. I poured a glass of water and made a short list on a yellow pad: card locked, alerts on bank at 9, bring patience. The apartment settled into the ordinary sounds of a place that has done its job: the refrigerator's low hum, a neighbor's laugh softened by drywall, the thin rush of air through a register. I ironed a shirt because men who intend to be taken seriously should look like they mean it even at a teller window. Before I turned out the light, I practiced a sentence I'd use in the morning. I did not authorize these charges. Facts first, feelings later. Then I set the alarm, placed the IRS envelope beside my keys where I couldn't miss it, and let the room go dark. Tomorrow would be for banks and forms and clear statements. Tonight was for holding the line I should have drawn years ago. Morning still felt a long way off, so I drove to the house that taught me how to be useful and parked under the same maple that drops helicopter seeds every spring. The porch bulb cast its small yellow circle, and the front door, painted a careful blue years ago, opened on the first try. I set my phone to notes, not record, and let the blinking cursor mark the time. 7:12 p.m. Kitchen. My mother and father sat at the good table with envelopes, a legal pad, and 2 highlighters laid out like tools. She spoke first without looking up, the point of her pen tapping the column of names. "You already nodded yes," she said, as if we were finishing a conversation we'd both been present for. My father added that we were past the debate stage. I typed the words exactly because exact words have a way of getting lost later if you don't pin them down. I told them I hadn't agreed. My mother smiled and called it logistics, the kind of smoothing phrase people use to turn a bill into a detail. "Address a few invitations and make yourself useful," my father said, sliding a stack toward me. The old trick of giving the quiet son something to do so he'll stop asking why it needs doing. The door opened again. Aiden came in with a breeze of cologne and certainty. Chloe followed with a color-tabbed binder. My mother stood like a curtain rising. "There's my sunlight," she said, hugging him and staying there a beat too long. Compliments flowed toward him the way a river knows its bed. Chloe spread swatches across the table, ivory, not bone, and spoke about peonies for the arch camera tones and seating charts as if they were settled law. Every time I tried to steer the talk to the charges, the conversation floated back to a picture of joy that asked no hard questions. I entered another time in my notes. 7:28 p.m. praise for Aiden guest list ongoing. The sentence I hadn't planned arrived and stood on its own legs. "Do you remember which school I went to?" I asked. My mother blinked. My father looked at Aiden as if the answer might be on his jacket. And silence puffed into the room like insulation. Community wasn't it? My mother tried choosing the safest generality. No, I said. The quiet that followed wasn't confusion. It was annoyance, the kind people use when reality interrupts their rehearsal. I typed 7:30 p.m. school question deflected and felt the small sting that comes when a simple fact can't find a home. Memory in that kitchen is not a museum, it's a revolving door. While Chloe described napkin folds, the past reached for me by the collar. There was the winter the furnace went down and the mortgage payments stared from the counter like a dare. Aiden had left one job for another that didn't hold. I had savings because I bring lunch and keep lists. I wrote the check to keep the house warm. We'll make it right, my father said, clapping my shoulder the way foremen mark a job done. The making right never came. What did come was a new story about how we take care of our own. Another year brought a hospital bill in an envelope that tried to look friendly with round fonts. Insurance had opinions. The balance remained. I put it on my card. My mother called me her rock for 3 days and on the 4th asked me not to tell my father because worry is bad for a man. The thanks thinned and vanished like steam. The tuition memory was dressed as optimism. A certification would change everything if only the registrar could be persuaded by a payment on the wrong side of a deadline. I covered it to keep the semester from collapsing. An investment in the family, my mother said, and the phrase lodged in me like a coin that sounded real enough to pass. This is how a certain kind of bond forms. Crisis arrives, the helper steps in, gratitude blooms briefly, and everyone resets to their corners until the next bell. The loop is flattering to the rescuer and comfortable for the rescued, and if you were raised to be reliable, you mistake the loop for love. Over time, the praise becomes a toll you pay to keep being the person they say you are. Across the table, my mother repeated her favorite lean into Aiden. You bring light, she said, eyes bright with a future she'd already monogrammed. I could have pointed out that light is a bill someone pays every month, not a miracle, but there is a moment when truth only starts a fire you don't intend to tend. I set another time in my notes. 7:46 p.m. refrain repeated. My father nudged the invitations my way again and called me good at this, by which he meant handwriting patience showing up. Compliment is leash. I'm not addressing anything tied to a charge I didn't authorize, I said, and the sentence stood by itself without wobbling. Chloe touched Aiden's arm and said we were all family, a line that lands sweet and costs nothing. I walked down the hall to the den and opened the file cabinet that still smells faintly of printer ink and dust. The labels taxes, warranties, medical were written in my mother's cursive. At the end sat a thin white binder without a printed tab. I had started it 8 years ago when I realized memory bends toward the voice that speaks most often. Inside were copies of checks, screenshots printed with dates in the margins, and receipts with sticky notes in my block letters. I had called it family ledger in ballpoint as a joke to keep it light. Jokes don't lighten much when the numbers stack. I slid it free and held the spine. Behind me, my mother asked what I thought I was doing, as if I'd put a hand on the wrong heirloom. Taking my records, I said, so we don't have to fight over what happened. On the shelf above the cabinet sat my grandfather's watch, the old kind with a pale face and a second hand that sweeps rather than ticks. He gave it to me when I took my first real job, and with it 2 sentences I can still hear under the smell of his pipe tobacco: don't miss a payment and protect yourself first. I thumbed the smooth back and felt the steady hum of time that belongs to no one's story but itself. Then I set it down exactly where it had been closed. The cabinet gently tucked the binder under my arm and returned to the kitchen. Text me what you want me to read, I said, and watched my mother absorb the change in rules. The guest list lay open like a map. My notes had times, not opinions. I stepped back into the night, typed 8:03 p.m. departure, and walked to the car with a quiet I recognized as the start of choosing myself. I drove straight from the old house to the bank in the morning light, the white binder on the passenger seat like a seatmate who didn't blink. Dana met me at the glass doors with 2 coffees and the kind of nod that steadies a man. Inside, Pioneer First Bank smelled faintly of toner and carpet cleaner. A banker with a careful tie introduced himself as Mark Feld and led us to a small office where the door closed with a soft click that said this conversation would be documented. I set the binder and my phone on the desk and started a fresh page in my notebook labeled Chain of Custody. I wrote the date, the time, who was present, and what we were handing over. Mark glanced at the header and approved. Good habit, he said, and asked me to walk him through only the facts. I did. He pulled up my account on his screen and moved through a practice series of keystrokes. Here's how this works under Regulation Z, he said, turning the monitor slightly so I could see without touching. We open a formal dispute today. The bank issues a provisional credit temporary within 10 business days, so you're not carrying the balance while we investigate. The investigation must be wrapped in no more than 2 billing cycles, typically 45 to 90 days. You'll receive written updates. He printed the case number and slid it across the desk with a pen. You'll also get a new card number. We'll enable real-time alerts on your profile and add an outbound phone verification PIN. No one should be able to authorize anything by phone without that PIN again. I signed where he pointed. He canceled the compromised card, issued the replacement, and had me set the PIN aloud, then watched me write it down on my own pad, not his copy. Now about the authorization call, he said, clicking into an internal log. We can't play the audio for you, but I can summarize the authentication audit. He read from the screen with the neutral tone of a man who has seen too many versions of the same mistake. Knowledge-based answers were delivered quickly, nearly verbatim to the format in our prompts, no paraphrasing, no hesitations. The system flagged the session as low confidence. The agent followed procedure and escalated to secondary verification. The caller referenced a power of attorney on file from years back. That note should have been archived. It wasn't. The agent accepted it. He stopped there and looked at me. We'll seal the log and include it in the case file. It will be preserved as evidence. It is a strange feeling to hear your life reduced to fields and flags. I added a line to my chain of custody page, 9:27 a.m. review of internal auth log. Summary received, audio not released, low confidence flag noted. Mark continued. We'll notify the acquiring banks and the merchants you mentioned. Oak Hollow Estate will receive a merchant dispute notice, as will the florist and the formalware vendor. That puts them on formal notice that funds are in dispute and shifts their expectations away from your card. He drafted the notices while we sat there, each one generating a confirmation number I copied into my notebook with the same neatness I use for server labels. We discussed alerts. He set mine to push every time a transaction over $500 tried to post, and showed me where to toggle travel online and card not present filters in the app. Last pieces, he said, credit bureaus. I handed him my phone so he could point without touching. With Dana looking on, I placed freezes at Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion, reading the confirmation numbers aloud while she wrote them on a separate page and circled them in blue. I scheduled a full credit report pull for that afternoon. We would check for any hard inquiries that didn't belong. You're doing this right, Mark said, not as praise, but as inventory. He printed a simple checklist and stapled my case number to it. Keep your notes, save screenshots. If anyone reaches out, refer them to this case. We stood. He offered his hand, and I shook it with the relief of a man who has facts marching in the right direction. In the lobby, Dana angled her shoulder close so only I could hear. One step at a time by the book, she said, and tilted her head toward the exit where sunlight made the floor look cleaner than it was. Outside, she tapped a contact on her phone. "There's someone I want you to meet," she said. Minutes later, we were at a small office 2 blocks away where a brass plate read, "Rachel Keene, attorney at law." Rachel listened without interrupting, took the case number, and asked for copies of the chain of custody page and the merchant notices. "You've got a head start, most people don't," she said. "We'll keep it that way." I felt the day settle into a shape I could carry. The binder was still light in my hands, but the weight of it had moved from me alone to a process with names, numbers, and dates that would not forget. Back on the sidewalk outside Rachel's office, I realized the day had given me something I hadn't had in years. A plan with edges. I took it home and went to work at the printer. From the white binder I'd pulled out of my parents' den, I compiled 8 years of transfers, checks, and receipts into a clean sequence, dates in the left margin, amounts in the right, brief notes in the middle that read like weather reports of other people's storms. Page after page slid into the tray until 40 sheets lay in a neat stack. I hole-punched them, snapped them into a thin black binder, and labeled the spine in block letters, "Family Ledger." The total at the last line, $68,000, wasn't a flourish. It was a sum of a posture. At the end, I added a 1-page summary that mapped those 8 years of shouldered expenses to the new exposure hovering over me now, the $99,000 in pending wedding charges. I didn't write adjectives. I wrote numbers because numbers keep their heads when people don't. Rachel had emailed over a template she called the financial boundary letter. I left her language intact and filled in the particulars. It prohibited anyone from using my name cards, accounts, or any existing or former authorizations for any purpose, personal or business. It directed all future contact to email, only listed a dedicated address I'd set up for that reason, and noted that phone calls and pop-up visits would go unanswered. It warned that violations would be forwarded to the bank's fraud unit, and if needed, to law enforcement. I printed 2 copies on heavier paper and signed each in blue ink. Then I scanned the set into a single PDF and saved it with the date in the file name. Rachel's paralegal called to say filings were underway. She had prepared 2 formal notices on her letterhead: revocation of prior power of attorney and notice of prior abuse of power of attorney. The first rescinded any prior authority anyone might claim to act in my name. The second documented the recent misuse of an expired temporary POA to authorize a card-not-present transaction. They were addressed to Pioneer First Bank's fraud department and to the vendors who had taken payment: Oak Hollow Estate, the florist, and the formal wear shop. Each letter demanded the bank remove all notes referencing the expired POA from my profile and confirm in writing that no POA remained associated with my accounts. The vendor copies requested written acknowledgement that no one could charge or rely on any representation of authority in my name. A courier would run the originals. I would receive scan confirmations and tracking numbers for the file. My part was simpler. I slid 1 copy of the family ledger and 1 boundary letter into a clasp envelope, wrote my parents' names on the front, and drove the familiar miles. I didn't ring the bell. I set the envelope on the hall table, took a photograph with the time showing on my phone, and sent a short text to both of them: documents delivered. Read the letter in full. Contact by email only. I went back to the car and emailed identical PDFs to the new address thread we'd created my parents on the 2-line Rachel CC'd subject line: notice of financial boundaries and ledger. The reply came faster than decency. From my father: a real man doesn't drag family to court. I didn't answer. I took a screenshot that captured the timestamp and his contact name, saved it to the dispute folder, and typed a brief note to accompany it. Text received from Robert Cole referencing potential litigation preserved for file. The phone buzzed again with a second message from him, shorter and hotter. I let it pass. Rachel, seeing the first screenshot arrive in her inbox, replied with one sentence. Received, logged, no response necessary. Back at my apartment, I checked email. Pioneer First Bank's fraud unit had written already. The subject line used my case number and the body confirmed receipt of the revocation and notice. Added that the POA notation had been removed from my profile and attached a PDF letter on bank letterhead confirming that change. I printed it and slid it into a clear sleeve at the front of the binder. I added the vendor read receipts as they appeared. Oak Hollow's system sent an automated acknowledgement with a ticket number. The florist replied with a 2-sentence note promising to forward to management. The formal wear shop sent a form confirmation. Each got a line in my log with time and reference numbers. Then I opened the boundary letter PDF one more time and read it steadily from top to bottom. It wasn't dramatic. It was a fence built with nouns and verbs. It made clear that the version of me who quietly carried the balance had been retired. I placed the thin binder on the shelf above my desk beside my grandfather's watch and sat for a moment listening to the new kind of quiet that follows a decision. The quiet that followed the filings lasted until the credit report hit my inbox like a bolt thrown at a locked gate. I opened the PDF and worked line by line the way I read server logs when I'm looking for the one entry that doesn't belong. Equifax first, then Experian, then TransUnion. All three showed the same bruise, a hard inquiry from 3 months back by a commercial lender whose name meant nothing to me. It wasn't tied to a car, a card, or a mortgage. It was coded business. I copied the inquiry details into my notebook and circled the date. Dana leaned over my shoulder. "Let's see who borrowed your name," she said, already opening her laptop. She started with the Secretary of State's business search and then pivoted to a commercial aggregator that stitches public filings together. On the screen, a new entity appeared with a confidence I recognized. Colebrook Partners, LLC. The mailing address matched Aiden's apartment number down to the suite, and the registered agent was a storefront service that files for anyone with a credit card and a plan. The organizer line showed my name. Dana clicked into a linked application profile the aggregator had captured from a banking partner. "Here," she said, tapping the screen. "They keyed your SSN into the business credit application." It's a peculiar feeling to see your life reduced to 9 digits in a field it was never meant to occupy. I took screenshots of each page, stamped the time under them in my notes, and saved everything to the dispute folder. We called Rachel from the same table. She listened, then asked for the inquiry IDs, the LLC details, and the address. "That hard inquiry ties to a business line of credit," she said. After a pause, I could hear her filling with checks. "It's mapped to your profile. We cut this off now." Her office drafted a cease and desist on letterhead with teeth in it. "Cease use of my name, identity, SSN, or any derivative within 48 hours. Preserve all records, communications, applications, and account statements. No deletion, alteration, or spoliation." The letter went to Colebrook Partners at the mailing address to the registered agent and to Aiden directly by email and certified mail. Rachel sent a parallel notice to the commercial lender referencing my consumer file and demanded a freeze on any draw against the line. While her paralegal cued the courier, Rachel walked me through 2 more pieces I hadn't expected to do in a single afternoon. We filed an identity theft report with the State Attorney General's office, attaching the inquiry screenshots, the LLC summary page, and my affidavit. The intake portal returned a complaint ID that Rachel read back to me while I wrote it twice, once in the notebook, once on a sticky that I stuck to the inside cover of the binder. Then we completed IRS Form 3949A on suspected tax fraud, describing how an entity tied to my SSN had been used without consent and flagged the mismatch between the LLC's mailing address and my residence. We printed a copy for my file and sent the packet certified, keeping the receipt like a small passport. As we stepped onto the sidewalk, my phone buzzed with a message from Aiden. Man to man, can we talk? It had the casual confidence of someone who thinks tone counts more than terms. I typed back that we could meet at a public cafe on Westover where the tables are close enough to make a scene uncomfortable. I added the time 24 hours out and signed only my first name. Dana nodded when I told her. "I'll be there," she said. Different table. I'll timestamp arrivals and departures and note anything material. No recordings. We agreed on signals, nothing dramatic, just the ordinary choreography of two people who intend to keep a clean record. Before we split, Dana suggested something else. Set up a burner email, she said, not to harass, to inform. If this LLC is being used to court suppliers or investors, you may need a channel to send neutral factual risk notices without exposing yourself to retaliation. She outlined the bones of it: a simple address, a one-page memo template with dates, case numbers, and public facts only. No adjectives, no speculation, no names that aren't already in filings. You don't use it unless you must, she said. But if they lean on your name to borrow money, the people being leaned on deserve to know the ground is soft. I went home and did as she suggested. I created the address, saved a blank memo with fields for time, source links, and document IDs, and left it in draft. Then I returned to the binder and added a new tab, LLC. Behind it, I slid the inquiry printouts, the business search results, and Rachel's letters marked sent with tracking numbers in the margin. The day had changed shape again. It wasn't just about charges that could be reversed. It was about a shadow business walking around with my credentials on its chest. I set an alarm for the cafe meeting and wrote 2 lines at the bottom of the page to steady my head. Keep it public, keep it factual. When Aiden's response finally came. "Sure, see you there." It read like a handshake given through a locked door. I closed the notebook, checked the watch on my desk, and listened to its steady sweep as if it could count down the last hours of a version of my life that had relied on grace instead of boundaries. The meeting came exactly when it was supposed to, 24 hours after the discovery of the LLC at a corner cafe where the tables sit close enough to make raised voices impractical. I arrived first and chose a seat with the windows at my back so I could see the door without needing to turn. Dana slipped in a minute later, took a position 2 tables over with her notebook open, and raised her coffee cup once in a signal we'd agreed meant she had eyes on the time. Aiden showed at noon sharp in a jacket that looked borrowed from a better day. Laid his phone face down like a man staging sincerity and didn't bother with small talk. "I borrowed your name for credibility," he said, low enough that only I could hear. "After the wedding, we'll fix it." He waved a hand at the idea of banks as if they were ushers who understood whimsies and intentions. "It's optics, Dan. People want to see a strong profile up front." I watched him talk and felt the familiar tug toward explanation, toward duty, toward being the person who doesn't make a scene. Then I stood. I didn't correct him or ask how he'd found my social or why he thought repair came after benefit. I pushed my chair and set a 10 under the saucer and said 2 words that worked like a closing door: "Not acceptable." He reached as if to catch the air between us and add language I'd have to carry. I left it there. As I passed Dana's table, she dropped her gaze to her page and noted the moment, then lifted her phone and took a single wide photo that caught nothing but the room, our table number, and the receipt the server had left between the salt and the sugar. Outside, the day was bright and busy in the way a witness should be: present, uninvested, accurate. The next morning, right as the elevators began their hourly duty cycle, my father entered my office lobby like a storm nobody had checked the radar for. He didn't sign the visitor log. He didn't lower his voice. He called me ungrateful so loudly that the receptionist startled and a patient liaison froze mid-sentence. He jabbed a finger through the space between us and announced to anyone within range that a son who drags family into paperwork is less than a man. I kept my hands open and at my sides and said, "We can't have this discussion here." Security moved with the calm of people whose job is to end the wrong kind of story before it reaches the stairs. They asked him to step outside. He refused, then remembered he was being watched and decided he cared. They walked him to the glass and he was still talking when the door closed behind him. HR called me in not for discipline but for documentation. I wrote a statement that contained only nouns, verbs, times, and the names of the people who heard the word, he shouted. They logged the lobby camera footage and sent me the incident number. I forwarded everything to Rachel, who replied with a single line acknowledging receipt and suggesting I refrain from any personal reply. After work, I drove to the house that had once been home and parked without cutting the engine. There are rituals a man performs when he finally wants the record to match the truth. I took the keys to that front door off my ring, set them on the doormat in a neat line, and took a photo with the time visible at the top of the screen. No note, no knock. I texted both of my parents a sentence at once: formal and final, keys returned. Contact by email only. On the way back to my apartment, a courier notice arrived on my phone for a letter waiting at the desk. I signed and slit the envelope to find stationery from a lawyer retained by my family. The letter accused me of making defamatory statements and promised suit if I did not retract unnamed falsehoods. It cited the kind of phrases that look impressive on paper and limp in court. I sent a scan to Rachel, who called me within 5 minutes. Her voice had no temperature in it. "We will respond." She drafted a reply on my behalf that did not apologize or explain. It demanded specificity. "Please identify each statement you claim is false. The date and medium of publication, the person to whom it was allegedly published, and any resulting damages you allege." She added a second page that lawyers call a preservation letter, instructing them to retain all relevant records: emails, texts, social media messages, call logs, bank notices, vendor communications, and drafts under a litigation hold. She sent it by email and certified mail and flagged that any deletion after notice would be considered spoliation. She closed with a simple reminder that truth is an absolute defense and that vexatious claims carry risks of their own. I read her letter and felt the curious calm that comes when a boundary moves from your mouth to paper with a letterhead that knows where to be filed. The day didn't feel triumphant. It felt square. I set the certified mail receipt under a clip in the binder, wrote the time beside it, and put my phone face down so no one could put new words in my field of vision before I was ready. By noon the next day, the certified mail receipts were clipped into my binder, and Rachel had me at her conference table with the ledger open, 2 laptops up, and a legal pad divided into columns labeled time, source, and action. We built a timeline the way you'd lay track bank statements, with the pending charges and their exact timestamps. The bank's summary of the low-confidence phone authorization, my screenshots from the first night, the lobby incident number from HR, and every email we had sent or received printed and numbered. When the bones were in place, we pulled the Oak Hollow contract and read it aloud, line by line, marking the clauses that mattered. The deposit could be placed by card on file, which is what had happened, but every remaining installment had to be paid by a wire transfer or cashier's check. There was a clear sentence buried 4 paragraphs down that gave the venue the right to pause services if funds were in dispute, or if any payment instrument became questionable. Another clause required the payer to present identification on site if requested on the day of the event. Those words were not weapons. They were rails there so a train stays on its track. Rachel drafted what she called a vendor risk notice for 3 parties: Oak Hollow Estate, the florist, and the caterer. The notice did not accuse. It informed. It stated the case number from the bank, the date of the disputed authorization, the fact that the card number had been canceled and replaced, and that any attempts to rely on the compromised card would be non-collectible if the dispute resolved in my favor. It attached the bank's acknowledgement that the prior POA notation had been removed and included the relevant contract clauses highlighted in yellow. It urged recipients for their own protection to request alternate good funds wire or cashier's check before proceeding, and to perform on-site ID checks of whoever presented payment. We sent each notice by email and by portal where available, and we requested written acknowledgments so nothing would be left to someone's recollection later. Within an hour, a reply arrived from Oak Hollow's events office asking to set a call with the venue manager. We joined a short video meeting with a woman who introduced herself as Sophie Delgado. She kept her expression even and her questions short. She had read the contract and had already highlighted the same clauses we had. She confirmed the card deposit was on file and now in dispute with the acquiring bank. In measured tones, she laid out what would happen next. Without good funds in the form of a wire or cashier's check delivered and verified by 10:30 a.m. on the wedding day, the venue would pause setup and hold the space until payment cleared or the contractual grace window expired. On site, her team would verify government ID from the person presenting payment and collect a personal guarantee from that same individual, tying them to any balance or damages if payment instruments failed. "We do not take sides," she said. "We follow the contract." Rachel thanked her for the clarity and asked that she send the same in writing. Sophie agreed and before ending reiterated that any arrangements between family members were outside the venue's concern. Their obligations ran to the contract and the payer of record on the day. The florist acknowledged our notice with 2 lines promising to hold product if the venue paused. The caterer responded with a copy of their own terms which mirrored Oak Hollow's approach wire or cashier's check for final payment, no service rendered if balance remained disputed. By late afternoon, Sophie's follow-up email arrived crisp and neutral. It repeated the requirements: the 10:30 a.m. deadline, the ID check, and the personal guarantee, and attached a 1-page form the payer would need to sign. She asked for the name of the responsible party expected to present funds, so her staff could prepare the file. We did not answer that question. We forwarded the email thread and the attached form to my parents at the address specified in the boundary letter, with Rachel copied and a short cover note stating simply that the venue had outlined its payment requirements and timeline. 10 minutes later, my phone flashed with my father's name and then fell silent when it found voicemail. A few minutes after that, his reply arrived by email where it belonged. He asked for more time. He said the bank would surely see reason and release the deposit because the event was important. Rachel answered on our behalf with a 2-sentence reply. The venue's requirements are governed by the contract, not by any expectations about pending disputes. If he intended to be the payer of record, he should be prepared to provide wire confirmation, government ID, and a signed personal guarantee upon arrival. An hour later, Sophie forwarded us a second email, this one from my father to her, asking whether the personal guarantee could be waived or signed after the ceremony, and whether a personal check would suffice in the meantime. Sophie responded to him the way she had to us, copying her earlier language and adding a single line per contract: we cannot proceed without good funds verified and the guarantee executed before services begin. There was no heat in it and no sympathy either, just the comfort of a rule that doesn't change when someone frowns at it. I printed her email, added it to the binder behind a new tab labeled Vendors, and wrote the deadline in the margin where I would see it every time I turned a page. The plan now had a clock on it, and the clock wasn't mine. Sophie's email put a clock on the wall, so Rachel and I spent the evening shoring up everything that could wobble when time ran out. The first break arrived from an unexpected quarter. The florist replied to our notice with a polite note about inventory timing and, perhaps by habit, forwarded the most recent thread from the bride. In the middle of that chain sat a single line from Chloe sent at 6:42 a.m. "We'll settle after the ceremony." The sentence wasn't bold or underlined. It didn't need to be. It admitted she knew payment wasn't in hand and intended to proceed anyway. Rachel read the thread twice, checked the headers to confirm it wasn't a copy and paste job, and dropped it into a new exhibit labeled Vendor Communications. She wrote the florist a brief thank you and attached an addendum that repeated the bank case number and asked them to hold per their policy if the venue paused. Then she forwarded the same thread to Sophie and to the caterer, not as ammunition but as part of the file vendors rely on when they have to explain to their own bosses why something pretty didn't happen on time. Sophie acknowledged receipt in the same neutral tone she used for everything. "Understood. Our team will apply the contract as written." The caterer echoed the posture, adding that any attempt to serve without verified payment would expose them to chargeback risk they would not assume. I printed the thread and added it behind the tab, then sat back and realized we had something we hadn't had before: proof that the plan was to float the day and square it later. That makes for good romance in movies and bad business in real life. With the vendor packet updated, Dana and I turned to the other flank. The burner address we'd set up lived on my laptop like a tool in a drawer you hope you never need. I opened it, built a clean memo with the date at the top, and wrote in a voice that sounded like a compliance officer on a deadline. Colebrook Partners LLC entity formed on date, using SSN not belonging to the organizer of record. Mailing address matching Aiden's apartment. State complaint ID, number on identity misuse. Bank dispute case number reflecting pending charge reversals tied to a wedding deposit. Lender notified under cease and desist to freeze any draw pending verification. Consumer credit file locked at all 3 bureaus. No accusations. Just facts, dates, and file numbers with public sources linked where they existed. Dana read it line by line and made me cut every adjective that could be mistaken for opinion. Then we sent it to 3 potential investor guests we knew by name from family chatter and a LinkedIn trail that anyone could follow. The subject line did not shout. It read simply due diligence notice regarding Colebrook Partners. We copied no one and asked for nothing. The first response came back in 12 minutes from a man who runs a small fund and writes emails the way he writes term sheets, with nouns you can measure. He thanked us for the notice, confirmed he would decline any forward commitment, and added that his counsel would be in touch with the LLC if necessary. The second reply arrived 20 minutes later, shorter but just as final. "We'll sit this out." The third didn't come as an email at all. It surfaced as a text from Aiden that lit my phone with a brightness setting I didn't remember choosing. "What did you do?" he wrote. I didn't answer. The point of a clean warning is not to start an argument, it's to put guardrails where cliffs begin. Before dinner, Dana forwarded 2 more investor auto-acknowledgements to the binder inbox and closed the laptop like a book that had reached a period. Aiden spent the evening trying to do what Sophie's note required: find good funds. He called his bank, but cashier's checks don't materialize out of optimism. They require cleared balances or credit that can be drawn without someone else's consent. The commercial line tied to my file was already under a freeze from Rachel's letter to the lender. He tried to pivot to a personal loan and discovered that new credit doesn't open itself when all 3 bureaus are locked and a lender is holding an internal flag. He pinged my father to sign the personal guarantee Sophie required, and the answer, if the timing of the emails meant what it looked like they meant, came back softer than a yes and harder than a no. He reached finally for the people he had invited to hear his pitch over champagne flutes and a string quartet and found their chairs suddenly empty. Not angry, just empty in the way business gets when risk walks in wearing a name tag. Rachel kept our side steady. She added Chloe's line to a single-page summary for vendors so every coordinator and captain working wedding day would see the same information in the same order. She sent a courtesy note to Sophie: should any party attempt alternate instruments the morning of the event, please verify identity and guarantee before releasing staff. Sophie replied with a time-stamped "we will," and that was that. It wasn't triumph I felt as the pieces clicked into place. Triumph is loud and uses words like "finally." What I had was the quiet that follows when leverage moves from hands that waved at rules to hands that read them. Somewhere across town, arrangements were being rearranged, and somewhere in a group text I didn't read, explanations were looking for a place to land. I checked the clock Sophie had given us and the watch on my desk. Both said the same thing: if there were going to be good funds, they had less than a morning to find them. Morning arrived, and the clock Sophie had set for everyone began to speak in minutes. At 9:06 a.m., her email landed in our thread with 2 sentences that carried the weight of a gavel. The acquiring bank's merchant portal had changed the card deposit to "in dispute," and Oak Hollow would require valid alternate payment before setup continued. She attached a screenshot of the portal status with the case number we recognized and added the exact language her staff would use at the gate: due to a technical payment issue, setup is paused pending verification of alternate funds. Please remain in the reception area. Donna printed the message, wrote the time in the margin, and slid it into the binder behind the vendors tab. By 10 o'clock, the venue's coordinators were walking the grounds with radios directing trucks to hold in a gravel lot instead of unloading at the service doors. Sophie sent a short update to all vendor captains: cashier's check or wire confirmation to be presented with government ID at the office before any services could proceed. The phrasing was neutral enough to hang in a museum. It did not mention me. It did not mention family. It cited only the contract and the status the merchant portal now displayed. From a small cafe 2 miles away, where the window gave us a soft view of the same morning sun falling on different brick, Dana opened a fresh page labeled "Wedding Day Log" and began noting arrivals and pauses as they were confirmed by the vendor's replies. At 11:15, the caterer emailed a single line from the loading area holding per venue instruction. Dana captured the header, printed it, and photographed the hard copy on the cafe table with her watch face in the corner so the time would live in the image. At 11:30, the florist's coordinator, who had been kind in earlier correspondence, wrote, "Bouquets remain in cold storage until payment verified." Dana performed the same ritual, save print photograph file like a careful archivist. At 11:40, the band's manager texted Sophie's office and CC'd the thread musicians standing by. "Please confirm when we can begin sound check." Sophie replied with her standard line identical to the morning's, ticking the requirement boxes without a hint of judgment. It wasn't a spectacle. It was a sequence, and watching a sequence obey rules is its own kind of theater. At 11:45, a man in a navy blazer and a messenger bag crossed the Oak Hollow parking lot with the unhurried gait of someone who only ever arrives on time. The process server signed in at the desk, asked for the 3 names he'd been given, and when each appeared, handed over envelopes one by one, his phrases clean and memorized. To my father, a cease and desist regarding use of my name and number. To my mother, a notice of identity theft. To my brother, a demand for preservation of records. The venue receptionist initialed a visitor log and noted the time. Sophie's assistant sent a brief service-completed confirmation to our thread at 11:49 with a scan of the reception log attached. Dana printed the email and added it to the stack. At 12:05, the thread showed a change of weather. Aiden ceased replying to Sophie and went dark for 7 minutes, then returned with a message that used more words than meaning, working on it just a delay. A minute later, a vendor captain noted privately to Sophie. And Sophie passed to us that the groom had stepped away from the property line with his phone pressed tight, speaking into the wind like a man negotiating with gravity. The venue clock did not pause for emotion. The deadline for good funds remained. At 12:20, the afternoon began to thin. 2 investors on the guest list whose names we had seen in earlier chatter arrived at the entry. Read the sign, exchanged a few words with the coordinator, and returned to their cars with the kind of practiced courtesy that marks people who keep calendars. A local business leader who was to give a toast checked his watch, conferred with a woman who looked like she knew where the power was kept, and left as well. None of them looked angry. They looked like people who had met rules before and recognized them again. In the cafe, I watched Dana work the small machine we had built. She captured Sophie's final noon update. Awaiting verified funds, staff on hold per contract, and added it to the log with the same neat handwriting she uses for server labels. I kept my voice low and said the only sentence that belonged in that room. Doing it by the book. No names were dragged across a screen. No private data was exposed. The only things visible were timestamps, contract language, and the consequences that follow when instruments fail. Outside, somewhere beyond the reach of our window, a lawn that had been staged for a story waited for a page that would not turn. The band's cases stayed latched. The florist's coolers stayed shut. The caterer's ovens stayed warm but clean. When a system refuses to proceed without the right inputs, it isn't stubborn, it's sound. At 12:31, Sophie sent one last note, calm as all the others, absent receipt of good funds setup remains on pause. We will hold space within the contractual grace period. There was nothing to argue with in that sentence, and that was the point. Dana laid her pen down. The binder, a little heavier now, made a satisfying thud when she closed it. The venue's clock reset to silence, but the paper clock kept moving. 10 business days after the dispute opened, Pioneer First Bank posted a provisional credit to my account. It arrived as a plain line on a statement with the case number in the memo field. The least dramatic way a burden can be lifted. The balance that had looked like a cliff pulled back into ordinary ground. Rachel told me to treat the credit as borrowed time and not as winnings. The investigation would run its course and the decision would be written in the same quiet ink. We kept the file active. Vendors sent their final acknowledgments of pause. Sophie's team closed their internal ticket with a courteous note about grace periods and unclaimed time. Oak Hollow followed their contract to the letter, when no verified funds appeared within the window. The event was canceled per terms, and the signing party was billed the cancellation fees listed in the appendix. The invoice did not come to me. It went to my father, whose email address and signature sat on the original agreement months back. He asked the venue to reconsider. They cited the clause. He asked for a payment plan. They pointed to the personal guarantee he had declined to sign and the absence of any funds to guarantee. Contracts are not cruel, they are indifferent in the way a level is indifferent to a plea that a bubble ought to move. Around the 6-week mark, the bank's decision landed. Pioneer First Bank sent a letter confirming that the chargeback had resolved in my favor. The merchants who had charged the card could not demonstrate good funds for posted transactions under the circumstances documented in the case. The provisional credit converted to permanent. I printed the letter and slid it behind the first tab in the binder. I added a note to myself at the bottom of the page: keep every page until the statute runs. There were limits to the scope of the card system, and we honored them on paper. Any sums the family had attempted to push by wire or cashier's check to vendors outside the card rail were not subject to chargeback. Those, if any, existed remained theirs to absorb. We didn't go hunting. We stayed in our lane and the lane was enough. The government acknowledgments arrived in a measured cadence at agencies that don't hurry for anyone. The Attorney General's office sent a confirmation letter with the complaint ID we already had, noting that identity theft complaints are reviewed and routed, and that additional information might be requested. The IRS mailed a brief acknowledgement that Form 3949A had been received. It reminded the sender that the service does not comment on the status of investigations and that no further updates should be expected. It read like the underside of a lid, and that's what it was meant to be. Rachel used the quiet days to shore up boundaries that needed more than verbal braces. She sent a no-contact notice to my parents and to Aiden, citing the case numbers, the HR incident at my office, and the bank's chargeback decision. All future communication was to go through counsel. Any direct contact calls, texts, unannounced visits would be treated as a violation and used to support a request for a protective order. The letter landed and the phones stopped ringing. Silence, it turns out, can be a mark of respect when it's earned the hard way. Dana spent an evening at my kitchen table helping me reset the parts of life people forget to harden until something hits them. We swapped my phone number for a new one and parked the old line on a voicemail that gave a single instruction: contact counsel at this address. We opened a P.O. box and routed my bank and tax mail through it so nothing important would visit my lobby. We walked through my online accounts and added a physical security key where the option existed, changed recovery emails, and killed old sessions that had been running since I was young enough to think a password was privacy. She set calendar reminders for quarterly credit pulls and wrote the dates on a card I tucked behind my grandfather's watch. When we finished, she closed the laptop and said, "There's not much left to take." It didn't feel like a fortress, it felt like a lock that finally matched the door. The binder on my desk wasn't thinner, but it read differently now. The first pages told a story about exposure. The last pages told a story about limits on money, on access, on the assumption that family can stretch a name until it covers whatever they need it to cover. The rules hadn't made me safer by themselves. Writing them down and then living them had. With the binder finally reading like limits instead of losses, the next task felt obvious. Decide what name would live on the limits I'd set. I drove to the county courthouse with a folder under my arm and asked for the civil window. The clerk slid me the petition for a name change and a short checklist that read like a set of promises to myself: post a notice, pay the fee, appear on time. 2 weeks later, a judge in a quiet courtroom read my petition, asked if there was any intent to defraud, and signed an order that turned Dan Cole into Daniel Keaton in one clean stroke of a pen. I walked out with certified copies, and for the first time in a long time, the feeling that paper and person matched. Government offices don't reward poetry, they respect sequence. I took the court order to the Social Security office and handed it through the glass with my existing card. The clerk stamped a receipt and told me a new card would arrive by mail. I made a DMV appointment, surrendered the license that had traveled everywhere with me, and sat for a new photograph while a printer warmed up behind a partition. At the bank, a manager updated my profile and reissued checks and a debit card that would arrive in white envelopes over the next week. At work, HR changed payroll and the email directory. My badge printer spit out a new rectangle with the same face and a different name. The string of confirmations felt less like reinvention and more like repair. In the middle of these errands, I kept my first appointment with Dr. Linda Park, a therapist whose office smelled faintly of tea and old books. She listened to the shape of the last months and drew a small loop on her legal pad. Crisis Rescue Gratitude Reset. She called it a trauma bond and explained why it feels like duty to the person trained to carry the water. Intermittent reward, she said gently, is a powerful teacher. It convinces you that the next rescue will finally earn you a permanent place. Her homework didn't sound like therapy so much as maintenance. Make a list of non-negotiables and tape it inside the front cover of your planner. End all verbal authorizations. If it isn't in writing, it isn't happening. Add a sleep on it rule to any request that mixes money and emotion. For anything larger than a routine expense, require a document with names, dates, amounts, and signatures. Build a small reserve in an account no one else can see or touch. Feed it first, not last. Schedule 1 hour a month to review credit reports and a second to review who has keys to your life, logins, backups, beneficiaries, the quiet places people forget. We spoke about guilt as a habit and boundaries as a muscle that grows only when used. I left with a page of assignments that looked suspiciously like freedom written as tasks. A week later, an envelope arrived from a law firm I recognized from my grandfather's estate. Thick with photocopies and thinner with the check it protected. The cover letter referenced a clause he had added years ago to a small pour-over trust, a practical man's way of offering help without fuss. Upon credible evidence that my identity had been misused, the trustee would release a modest reserve and deliver a few items he had set aside. The packet included a certified copy of the court order. A note in his square handwriting reminding me that a good name is both what you inherit and what you keep. A pocket compass with a worn brass face and a deposit slip tied to an account meant only for legal fees and emergencies. It wasn't a windfall. It was a hand on a shoulder from a man who had always spoken in tools rather than speeches. The same afternoon, an email slid into my inbox from Mark Feld with a subject line that carried the ease of work well done, case file closure confirmation. He attached a final memo noting that the dispute had resolved in my favor and the internal ticket was now closed. No drama, just the kind of administrative full stop that lets you shelve a folder without flinching. I forwarded the note to Rachel for her records and filed the PDF under the first tab of the binder that had started as a list of what I'd paid and had become a map of how I stopped paying for what wasn't mine. When Dana saw the new license, she held it at arm's length like a photograph of a friend. "Keaton sounds solid like you," she said, and it landed the way simple truths do, square and quiet. I slid the card back into my wallet behind the security key she'd insisted I buy. Set the compass next to my grandfather's watch on the shelf over my desk, and felt something settle that had been rattling for years. A name is an address. For the first time since I can remember, mine points to a place I actually live. Mornings began to feel ordinary again, and on one of them an email slid into my inbox with a subject line that used my first name like a key. It was from Maggie, and the body of it walked in circles. She said no one had meant harm, that families speak past each other, that I had overreacted and made private business public. She regretted how things looked but never once said what had been done. She asked for a reset, then added a paragraph about how much stress the situation had caused. I read it twice, felt the old reflex to smooth and explain rise up, and forwarded it to Rachel without a reply. Rachel answered her directly. She acknowledged the strain of recent weeks and said she was sorry for any distress my parents felt. Then she declined the invitation to rewrite events. She noted clearly and without heat that the private settlement window Rachel had offered 72 hours after the first filings had closed long ago with no response. that the bank's chargeback decision and the court order had now set the record, and that any further discussions would be conducted between counsel only. She appended the no-contact instruction and reminded their side to preserve all records already identified. It read like respect with a spine. I signed my name to a one-line instruction for Rachel to keep using wherever it was needed future contact only through counsel. The air changed after that, not overnight, but distinctly the way a room feels once a window has been shut and latched. A week later, I asked Dana to meet me for coffee at the little cafe where so many pages of this began. The server tucked menus under our elbows and drifted away. We didn't need to say much. I took the paper menu in both hands and folded it into the same leaf my mother used to make at the kitchen table when I was young, then set it between the sugar packets like a small finished thing. Dana watched me, understood, and gave a single nod that said, "This time the ending belongs to you." If you're watching this and wondering where a person even starts when the people who raised you confuse love with access, start small and make it practical. On the banking side, turn on alerts for any transaction over $500 so surprises arrive as notifications, not statements. Add a phone verification PIN with your bank so no one can authorize anything by charm alone. If a charge smells wrong, lock the card in the app first, then file the dispute and let the system work. Remember that provisional credit typically posts within 10 business days, and that Regulation Z gives banks up to 45 to 90 days to resolve. For your identity, freeze your credit at Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion so lines no one told you about can't bloom in the dark. Check hard inquiries and pull your full reports quarterly so you spot bruises before they turn into fractures. Never give your social security number over the phone to anyone who called you. If it matters, you can call back on a verified number and ask for a written request. On the legal front, revoke any old powers of attorney you signed when you thought hope was a plan, and do it in writing with copies to the institutions that might still have them on file. When you gather proof, keep a chain of custody notebook: who collected what, when, and where it lives. Because evidence isn't just facts, it's their handling. If contact turns ugly or erratic, a simple no-contact notice through counsel can clear the air. And a process server can deliver papers that people suddenly find time to read. None of this will make blood run warmer, but it will stop it from being drawn on demand. After we finished our coffee, I walked Dana to the corner and thanked her for being the one steady witness a man needs when the room insists he imagined the fire. She smiled and told me to keep the leaf folding for better tables. We parted in the kind of sense that isn't empty. It's earned. If you've lived through a version of this, I'd like to hear what held and what broke. Tell me in the comments where your line finally drew itself and what you wish you'd known earlier. If this story helped you name something you've been carrying, subscribe and stay with us. There are more true, careful stories coming, and each one is an invitation to set a boundary you can stand on. They wanted silence, I chose evidence. They wanted me to pay, I reclaimed my name. This is where the story closes: a man used by his family for his name and his money, who chose the law, the evidence, and his own name. No shouting, no spectacle, just timestamps, documents, and boundaries put in the right places. If you've ever faced the same fork in the road, keep the peace to keep the house quiet, or stand up so your mind can rest. Tell me which way you'd go and why. Have you had relatives cross lines with your finances, identity, or privacy? How did you handle it? At that noon wedding, what would you have done differently? I want to hear your story, the parts you protected, the parts you lost, and one small step you'll take after watching. Turn on spending alerts, freeze your credit, revoke an old power of attorney, or simply write down the boundaries you expect others to respect. If this helped you name what you've been carrying, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Drama with practical tools to protect yourself. Click subscribe, turn on notifications, stay with us, and share this with someone who needs the reminder that boundaries aren't ingratitude, they're respect. I'll meet you in the comments and in the next episode.